Hello again. The last video we were talking about the Sumerian religion and discussing the various elements of it. Today, or in this video, we are going to continue that discussion, as well as talk about some of the other elements that make up Sumerian civilization. So you'll remember that we said that religion was very important to the Sumerians, and as a result, they're going to have a lot of different holidays and rituals and ceremonies, all of which are geared towards keeping their gods happy. I'm going to talk about two specific ones, two specific types of ceremonies that we see in Sumerian religion, although they're not exclusive to the Sumerians. Other cultures did them as well. The first of these is something called sacred marriage or hierogamy. That's what those two words in Greek smushed together mean. Hieros means sacred and gamos means marriage. So hierogamy is sacred marriage. This is a bit of a euphemistic term for a ritualized sex act that would occur as part of like a magical ceremony during the year in the Sumerian religion. John Green talks about this in his crash course videos. He talks about it as scoodly pooping. But this is where an important male figure, whether that was a chief priest or maybe the king, would have a ritualized sex act with another human figure, a female figure, who was supposed to represent the goddess Inanna, a life goddess. And the thought was that this act of fertility that humans are creating would magically, with the right sort of rituals and ceremonies, help to magically ensure the prosperity or the fertility of the Sumerian world. So the idea is this fertility act will magically make the rest of the world fertile. And it's no surprise why they would engage in this kind of thing. They're very concerned with fertility. We know that humans care a lot about fertility and that their religion is often very geared towards that. So this is just a way that the Sumerians would try to encourage fertility in the world around them using a magical ceremony. The other thing is called divination. And divination is basically telling the future in lots of different ways. Lots of different strategies were used to help tell the future. You may know of things like tarot cards or Ouija boards. These are different ways that people try to figure out what's going on with the gods or with spirits, try to learn about the future, or learn about things that can't be seen. Well, the Sumerians were very interested in divination because you'll have to remember, they did not think that their gods liked them very much. They thought that their gods hated them. And so the idea that we want to know what the gods want from us before we do anything would be very appealing to the Sumerians, right? So you do some kind of magical thing to try to figure out what the gods want. You look at fire, or you look at tea leaves, you look at, all these different ways, they're magic ways that you can figure out what the gods want or what the future will bring. And again, the Sumerians are very concerned that the world around them is cruel and unforgiving. And so they are doing their best to make sure that they can figure out what's going on magically so that they can be ready for it when it comes. Again, not unique to the Sumerians, something we see in a lot of ancient cultures. Okay. We also know that the Sumerians believed that there was an afterlife, that your spirit did not perish and die after you died. They thought that your spirit would go to some sort of afterlife. But for the Sumerians, again, who have this very pessimistic attitude towards life, they think, well, if life while we're alive is so bad and unpredictable and terrible and the gods hate us, then why would the afterlife experience be any better? So for them, they thought that when you died, your spirit went to a place that was pretty terrible. There's a famous description of it in the Epic of Gilgamesh that reads, "The place where they live on dust, their food is mud, and they see no light, living in blackness. On the door bolt, living in blackness. On the door and door bolt, there is deeply settled dust," meaning no one goes in or out. If the door is covered in dust, then that means it doesn't open at all. So nobody can leave, right? Definitely not sounding like a great place. I mean, compare this to sort of the Christian conception of heaven where, in popular culture, it's all sunshine and clouds and everyone's happy, right? This is not what the Sumerians think. They also thought that, if you were buried with good things, like if your family buried you with all your favorite possessions, then demons would steal all that stuff from you. And they also thought that your spirit somehow stayed connected to your bones, so that if something bad happened to your actual grave where your bones were, then your spirit would feel that bad stuff happening to them too. So if your grave was disturbed, it would hurt or harm the spirit. Like you can't even be freed from being hurt while you're a spirit. It would still hurt you. So all of this is very much connected to that pessimistic attitude that we expect from the Sumerians, this idea that life stinks, life is terrible. And if life is terrible, then why would our afterlife be any better? Okay. The Sumerians did invent some very important pieces of technology. We think that they may have been the first people to use wheeled vehicles, and they probably invented the sail and the plow. They may be the first humans to use bronze in metal. And we also know that they developed some pretty complicated arithmetic and geometry, which primarily was originally used to help keep track of the movements of the planets. Specifically to help with things like creating calendars for planting. They also famously invented a number system that was based on the number 6 or 60, which we would call a hexadecimal system, a 6-based system. And it's from them that we get this idea that there are 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle. The really interesting thing about their math system is that every god was associated with a different number based on whether they were the more important or less important god. And so, they literally ranked their gods. And I think it's really interesting. We don't think that way. People don't think about, we know that Zeus in Greek mythology is, the top dog god, but we don't think about, like who's the fifth god, rank wise. It's very interesting. I think the most interesting thing to say about all this is you say, well, why did the Sumerians come up with all this stuff? Why were they the first to come up with a lot of these things? And the answer, of course, is they are the first civilization because they had such a great agricultural setup. They had a place where agriculture could take place very easily, the Fertile Crescent. And agriculture is the thing that pushes all of your other technology along. So we're not shocked to find out that the first people to invent the plow are the people that had the best agriculture setup, or that the first people to come up with math as a byproduct for figuring out calendars are the people that had a great agriculture setup. So no surprise that the earliest civs that have the earliest and best agriculture setup are going to have the earliest tech, specifically the tech that's going to help with agriculture. We've talked a bit about cuneiform in person, but it's important to kind of go over the details. Cuneiform, their writing system, which is arguably the most important piece of technology from their civilization, was invented around 3200 BC. You don't need to know that date. It gets its name from the Latin word cuneus, which means wedge. The wedge is a wedge-shaped tool that was used to write in the clay. We call that tool a stylus. And so you're pressing this stylus into the clay to make these wedge-shaped, triangular-shaped markings. Like all ancient writing systems, it starts with a pictographic system where the thing that you're writing is supposed to look like the thing it represents. And then later on, the symbol changed and was adapted and altered to look like something that was not necessarily the same as the original image, the original pictograph, but which was easier to write with the stylus. That evolution of the characters is mirrored by the evolution of how the writing was used. So originally, they probably used it just to keep track of how much stuff they had, how much oil is kept in the storehouse. Well, here's the symbol for oil, and here's how many we have of oil, right? But later on, as the writing system gets bigger and better, they start using it to record more complex stuff. So it starts from just being used to make lists, and then they can start using it to write stories, to write down prayers or contracts or more complicated things. Okay. So it starts off used for a very simple reason, but then as time goes on, it starts to become used for a much more complicated system. Now, writing and learning to writing required a lot of effort. We take literacy, reading and writing, for granted nowadays, that everybody knows how to read and write. But in antiquity, learning how to write was a very complicated process. requiring a lot of study. It required a lot of free time, which means that you probably had to be fairly wealthy in order to learn how to do this. And the people that did learn how to do this, learned how to read and write, did so with great effort spent and with harsh punishments levied against them. If they didn't learn properly, they were punished harshly. So being a scribe, learning how to read and write, was a very difficult process, but which could come with a lot of rewards because you were so valuable in Sumerian society. The other interesting thing about being a scribe in any ancient world is that if you spend all your days copying stuff, writing stuff down, copying things, that means you're also, as a side benefit, learning about all the stuff that you're writing down. So if you sit down every day writing down math, copying math textbooks, you're eventually going to learn math. Or if you're constantly writing down, religious texts, eventually you're going to learn all about religion because you spend the whole day reading those things, right? And this was the primary way of learning. So scribes were very valuable in society, and they became very learned, very knowledgeable about lots of different things as a sort of accident. But not everybody could be a scribe. It required a lot of training, a lot of punishments, harsh punishments if you did badly, and lots of studying. But those who could pull it off were in a really good position in society because it meant that they had a really good setup and they were very valuable to their civilization. This is just an example of the evolution of a particular letter, tag. You can see it changing its shape over time as it gets simplified into something that's less writing with curves and more writing with single straight lines, which can then more easily be written with the stylus, the cuneiform stylus. This is just an example of what cuneiform looks like when it's all put in one big place as opposed to a single symbol. The most famous piece of writing from the Sumerians is the story of one of their famous figures, this man named Gilgamesh, sometimes called Bilgamesh. This is what he looks like in the Mesopotamians music video, but he looks probably something more like this, according to some of the more contemporary art pieces. Gilgamesh is what we would call a legendary figure. A legend is a story. It's a type of mythology, but it's a story that has a focus on the human world, although albeit with a little bit of magic and stuff mixed in, monsters. But its primary focus is on the human world, and it has at its core some kind of historical truth. There's a sort of real piece of true history at the center of that story. And while that story may have had lots of added things that are not necessarily true mixed in with it, monsters and magic and all that stuff, the core of it, the real of it is a real thing. And this is what we know about Gilgamesh. He was a real person. There really was a king of the Sumerian city of Uruk called Gilgamesh, right? Who lived at a certain time period. But the problem is some of the more specific details of his life don't really add up. So we're told, for instance, that he lived in 2600 BC. That matches up with what we would expect. But we're told that he lived for 126 years. Probably not likely. Or we're told that he was partly divine, that he was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, which I don't know how mathematically you can make that happen, right? If you're part God, if one of your parents is a god, you're going to be 50-50, one half mortal and one half divine. I don't know how you get 2/3 divine. So some of these factors don't add up. And that's not the only thing. I mean, his story is full of lots of really interesting elements. He's fighting monsters, he's talking to gods, he's looking for immortality, all these things, right? And that's basically the run of his story. But what's more interesting for our purposes is seeing how he fits into this scribe culture, okay, in Sumeria. Originally, there were hundreds of stories all about this guy, all different stories being told by all different people, and they weren't being written down. Eventually, though, after all this time, a single guy named Sinleki Unini, and you don't need to know that word, eventually took all of those stories and collected them into a single piece of written work called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the whole thing was for scribes. It was a scribe taking the story so that other scribes could read it and study it and learn how to be scribes by seeing what he did and all of that. So it's a really interesting thing, because if it wasn't for scribes, we wouldn't have this story that's so crucial for understanding mythology, for understanding history. Wouldn't have any of it if not for the scribes, right? And the Epic of Gilgamesh is sort of like the most quintessential piece of literature, some of the earliest literature in the world. And so it's got a really important role to play in the history of literature. This is an example of one of the tablets that contains the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the tablet that describes the famous flood that the gods unleashed on humans to destroy the world. And this is what Sinleki Unini was doing. He was taking all these stories and copying them onto these tablets so that we would be able to have them for later on. So Sumeria doesn't last forever. Like all civilizations, it rises and then starts to fall. Around 2500 BC, Sumeria started to get conquered by other invaders. And Sumeria stopped being its own independent collection of city-states and started to be ruled by other people. So by 1900 or so, Sumer existed still, the cities existed still, and the cultural elements existed still, but they were no longer independent. They were being controlled by a new set of rulers every so often, every couple of years or so. A new empire would come to be, and then they would be in charge of Sumeria. And then another ruler would take that guy over, and then Sumeria would be a part of that new empire. So Sumeria as an independent place stops being a thing around 1900 BC, and it starts to be ruled by other people. What was crucial about Sumer, though, was that its cultural achievements, especially its writing system, were then shared with every single group that followed, and every group that came into existence afterwards and ruled Mesopotamia was basically stealing and using the ideas that the Sumerians came up with. So the Sumerians invented a writing system that was then used by every single person that interacted with the Mesopotamian cities after that, right? So Sumeria does not stay an independent nation by itself for very long, but its cultural impact is felt long after it ceases to be an independent group and starts to become a collection of city-states instead. All right, so that's it for Sumeria, and that's it for section 1 of chapter 2. Our next discussion will be about the sort of rapid-fire series of other empires and other rulers that took over Mesopotamia after the Sumerians, these different groups that ruled Sumeria in the wake of the Sumerians sort of falling apart. So we'll save them for next time.